All right, well, let's turn to Genesis. We're going to be here in Genesis chapter number 41. We split this up. We started in Genesis 39 last week when we got through Genesis 39, chapter 40, and then chapter 39 and chapter number 40. And we talked about in chapter number 39 just a little bit of a refresher here about obviously Joseph as overseer. And then we went into chapter number 40 and talked about how that the butler and the baker were in prison, and Joseph was unable to interpret their dreams. And we find out that the butler forgot about Joseph, and we talked about how that Joseph was thinking, and this is one time in Scripture where we see that Joseph actually placed his faith and trust in an individual, a man, instead of placing his faith and trust in God. And he was thinking to himself, well, maybe this guy can put in a good word. And he makes a request and says, hey, listen, since I've shown you kindness, could you show me a little kindness? And when you come before him, the Pharaoh, would you please just remember me? But some of the most disturbing words and probably heartbreaking words that we find is the last verse there in chapter number 40, where it says, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. Now, that would be hard. That would be a very hard thing to accept. So it wasn't, though, and we have to remember this. Everything happens in God's timing and in His plan. Oftentimes that's hard for us to accept. That's hard for us to realize. But God's working everything out according to His perfect plan. And God is a sovereign God. He's in control of all things. Sometimes it looks puzzling. Sometimes it looks a little bizarre. But you got to remember, God's still on the throne. He's still in control. And so here with Joseph, we realize that God is allowing him to be in these circumstances for a reason. He's growing him. He's stretching him. He's building character. And then we find out here that even though Joseph thought he could get out of this, God was going to keep him there for another short period of time. But we're getting ready to find out that it was God's time for Joseph to shine. And it was time for him to come out. And that's what we're going to find out here in chapter 41 here this evening. So here we find out, let's read verse number 1 first. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, this is chapter 41, verse number 1, that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. So 2 years have passed. And Joseph is still working in the prison house, waiting for something to happen. Now, when I think about that, just like I mentioned earlier, we have a hard time waiting. I know that I do at times. You just go into a fast food place, and you're trying to get in and out for a lunch break, or trying to get in and out, and you're trying to get somewhere, and you come in and you find out there's this long line, and you're just tapping your foot, and it seems like the person in front of you just cannot make up their mind what they want. They're going through the whole menu. Could you please tell me that again? No, wait a minute, scratch that. I want this. Wait a minute, no, I changed my mind again. And so we have a hard time with waiting. We do. We're an impatient people. But here we find out that 2 years have passed and Joseph's still waiting. He's waiting for something to happen. But when things start to happen and when God's in it, it seems like things happen really quickly. And so things happen very quickly here for Joseph. And we find out that it was God's time to activate him. It was God's time for him to take his position of where God had called him to be. And like I mentioned earlier with the sovereignty of God, this is a really important chapter because I believe this is where you see God really working and using His sovereign will to accomplish what He wanted to accomplish. So let's look here first at 2 dreams that we see within this passage when we're dealing with Pharaoh. So we read verse number 1, and verse number 2 says, And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-flavored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up unto one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that can interpret them unto Pharaoh. Now, so God caused this deep sleep to come over Pharaoh, and Pharaoh dreamed these. And it was these 2 dreams, these very vivid dreams. Now, the word behold is actually a word that means vividness, and it was a very clear thing. Now, I don't know about you, but there's been times where I've dreamed and I've woke up and I've had to think to myself, was this real? Was this something that actually happened? Because it was so vivid. It was just so clear about what happened and things that I could remember. And so Pharaoh was able to remember this. Now, this is a distinction, however, from King Nebuchadnezzar, because if you remember in Daniel chapter number 2, King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed, but he couldn't remember what he dreamed. But here we find out that the Pharaoh did remember what he had dreamed, and it was very vivid here. So what he does, he dreams these dreams, and then it come to pass, it tells us in verse number 8, that he was troubled. And what does it mean by saying that he was troubled? Is that he was wondering to himself, what does all this mean? I mean, what does this mean that I have dreamed? So he knew that there were magicians. He would have been very familiar with this. Magicians, you can call them soothsayers. They were individuals that could predict and they could also interpret what someone was dreaming or what they were talking about. So you can imagine he calls all these wise men together there within Egypt. And so he elaborates and he tells them what had happened in the dream. And they looked at him and probably thought to themselves, uh-oh, we're in trouble. We don't know how to interpret this. So here they find out they didn't know what it meant. Okay? And they told Pharaoh that. They said there was none that could interpret his dreams of what it was supposed to be. And so being a soothsayer, being a magician, being one that should be able to do this, it was probably very embarrassing and they just didn't know what to do. But here we find out something that did happen, and this is where God really sets into motion His plan and His purpose, is where Joseph is remembered. Let's look here at verse number 9. Then spake the chief butler, here he comes, he's showing back up, 2 years later, unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember. Wow. You know, he forgot about him, and now we find out that he remembers Joseph. He says, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me inward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker, which we know the chief baker is long gone, all right? And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was, me he restored unto mine house, and him he hanged. He's like, oh wow, wait a minute. I do remember now. There was this guy that was there with us in the prison, and it was so vivid, and he was able to interpret these things to us. And here he remembers Joseph. He remembers what he had done. And so the report of Joseph was what he wanted to hear. He wanted to know of someone that could actually interpret his dreams, that would be able to understand that. Now, here's an important question. Why do you think it was so specific for him to mention Hebrew here? I think that it's very likely that the Hebrew people were servants within the Jewish culture there, the Egyptian culture at that time. So that's why there was a mention there, and this wouldn't have been foreign to Pharaoh to know that they were servants. So he makes this mention of this Hebrew individual, which we know to be Joseph. Well, let's go here to the summoned part. So Joseph is remembered. He's remembered by this individual that now says he remembers. And we find out in verse number 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. Now, a question here. Why do you think, was it just him shaving himself? Was that just so he could appear before the Pharaoh? Or do you think that it is very likely that the Egyptian people did not have beards, they were all shaven? Anybody have a thought? Why do you think he shaved? Yeah, he probably was pretty bad looking. Okay, yeah. I read somewhere where it talked about that the Egyptians did not have beards. Sometimes we see maybe something portrayed. I don't know, just a thought there, that when he came before the Pharaoh, that it was just the appearance of being there, and it's very likely to be presentable. He shaved himself, so just some thoughts there. But it says here that he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it, and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. So he's saying, listen, I've heard that you have been able to tell people what their dreams meant. And so, can I tell you mine? Can I tell you what my dreams are about? And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Interesting here that in these set of circumstances that Joseph is still giving God the glory. He said, it's not in me, but it is of God. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored, and lean flesh, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat upon the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, and they were still ill-favored as at the beginning. So I awoke. And I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up on one stalk, full and good, and behold, 7 ears withered then, and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. So what's he doing here? He's rehashing, he's telling Joseph what he had dreamed, and he's saying, listen, there's nobody. I mean, none of my magicians, none of the soothsayers can do this. And so here in verse number 25 it says, and Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. So he's got 2 dreams, but he's saying the dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, what God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for the dream was doubted, or was doubled, not doubted, but was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the fifth part of the land of Egypt into the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store for the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. So it's very clear here. Joseph is relaying this dream that God has spoken to Pharaoh through these dreams. And we find out here that this was actually really good in the eyes of Pharaoh. It's what it says in verse number 7. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. See what God's doing here? See, God has allowed him to be in these circumstances, in this predicament. He has allowed him to be in this prison for 2 years, and now it's time for him to raise Joseph up, and Joseph is able to interpret these dreams that God has revealed to this Pharaoh, and now Joseph is found to be good in the eyes of the Pharaoh, the most important there in the land. And it says in verse number 38, and Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a good one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Now Pharaoh, a pagan individual, worshiping pagan and false gods. Now we have to understand that while Joseph was here in Egypt, he was very familiar with the paganism that was there, the false gods, the false ideologies that were there. And here we see that Pharaoh says unto his servants, can we find such a good one, or such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? See, Joseph was a person that was very likable. He was a person of integrity, and God was growing him. He was a person of character. We know this because of Potiphar's wife, where she tried to get him to lay out with her and to commit that evil wickedness, but Joseph refused, and even in the midst of that, he was lied about. Remember, we went back to that, talked about Potiphar, where he threw Joseph into prison after his wife had come and said, look at what this man has done unto me. But still through all of that, he kept his character. He kept his character. Remember when I talked about that last week? Is that, yes, in the face of a culture, people may speak wickedly about you. They may say this or say that. But if you're walking in truth and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, I'd rather have that than to know that I bent and gave in to a sinful type of condition. So something interesting as we look at there with the part there of Joseph. And then we find out in verse number 39, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God has showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Now, Joseph has been through a lot, okay? And for the third time in 13 years, he gave up his garment. If you've realized that. Coat of many colors. He gave up his garment. Remember when Potiphar's wife took that from him. And now he's given up that garment that he came in wearing, and he gave it up, but he gained the garment of a ruler. Because Pharaoh put him in a position of leadership and of authority. And that's what it talks to us about in verse number 39. It says, God has showed thee all this. There is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Boy, whew. Can you imagine just for a moment all he's been through, like I mentioned. He's been through it where his brothers despised him, okay? Where they wanted to kill him. Remember Reuben, what he did. He talked him out of it, threw him down into the well. He was brought out. He was sold into slavery. Remember, he was sold. Amalekites brought him into Egypt. And here he is in Egypt, and he's been through all this. He was at a point of being favored in Potiphar's house, and then Potiphar's wife did that, and he's thrown into prison. And Joseph has been into prison a few different times. He's been in some rough situations. And now to see God work, and then to hear those words from Pharaoh saying that, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Sort of a feel-good thing here. You can imagine, he's thinking to himself, okay, God, I've waited, and now I'm standing back and I'm watching you just work and do your thing. And isn't it amazing that when we do wait, and I know it's hard at times to wait, but when we do wait and we just step back, we can watch God work and watch things unfold and just watch things up. But we've got to be patient. We've got to be willing to say, okay, I'm not putting in and trying to fix things in my own way, but I'm waiting upon the Lord. I'm waiting for Him to fix the issue and do what He only can do. And that's what we find here. But also we look to this part in the last part here, and this is verses 46 through 57. We look at forgiving and forgetting the past. And it says here in verse number 46. Actually, let's read verse number 40. Read down through verse number 46. Thou shalt be over my house. Listen to what Pharaoh says. And according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had made, and they cried before him, Bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephaniah. It's a long word there, isn't it? Long name that was given. And he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. But then we transition to this part here in verse number 46. This is forgiving and forgetting the past. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the field which was round about every city, laid he up the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the land of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph was born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which were Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For God said, He hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. That word there, Manasseh, is an interesting word because it is forgetting. It's about letting things go. And that's one thing that we can really take from this verse here and remember is about letting stuff go. Letting the past go. Letting things go that maybe allow us to harbor feelings or whatever may be going on in our life. And then verse number 52, and it says, And the name of the second he called him Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Well, those 2 verses right there, you could preach a lot just from those. Very important how that he was hurt. I mean, he had so much that he could be bitter about, all the things that have happened to him. But he named his second. He called him because he said, God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Those things that people thought for bad, God used for good. We know that verse very clearly, Romans 8:28, a verse that we come to often. But then it says here in verse number 53, "And the 7 years of plenteous that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said, and the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith unto you. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was sore in all the lands." So Joseph opened this up for people to come to the storehouse to be able to get what they needed because of this famine. And we know what this eventually leads to. This is where Jacob and his family come because they're in a time of need, and they come looking for food. And that'll lead us into what we go into next with our next series of lessons that we look at about Joseph when he encounters his brothers and finds out about his father. And then we know what happens with Benjamin as well. So very interesting there as you see how all this takes shape and how all this moves forward, especially with Joseph and how that he names his sons, what so important names about his life and what has transpired. And then him being in control, Pharaoh giving him this authority to do whatever he knows to do, and the people come to him as he's placed him in that authority. But such a very important passage of what we have seen here. 13 years, God enabled Joseph to accomplish some wonderful things. And he brought blessings to Potiphar's house and to the house and the people in the prison. He overcame a lot. And Joseph was a man of faith, and he was ready for God to work and to do some amazing things there. But there was still one more achievement that in some ways was the greatest of all, is that he was enabled by God's grace to wipe out, like I mentioned, those pains and those memories and start afresh. And I think that's what I mentioned earlier is something that people do struggle with. They get wrapped up in the past. They get so wrapped up with things that have happened. And it's best just to stop and realize that this is stuff I need to let go and I need to move on. It's sort of like I heard someone say this, it's like a bad attitude is like a flat tire. You can't go anywhere until it's fixed. And so a bad attitude about what's happened, a bad attitude about past circumstances can really, really sidetrack you and just send you down a direction you don't need to go. And that needs to be fixed. And sometimes people, even in churches, get this type of an attitude. Some people just stop coming. Some people just stop going because of a bad attitude they have. Maybe it's something someone has said, something that someone has done. But the best remedy for that is just to let it go and to forgive them. I've preached about forgiveness before, but oftentimes when we don't forgive, we're in a prison cell and we have the key in our possession, and we're the only one that can really let ourselves out, because they're not holding us in there. They don't have the key, we do, and we are the ones that keep ourselves in there. And it's so important that we let ourselves out of that situation, because if not, it's just going to hinder us, it's going to hurt us if we continue to stay in those circumstances. But Joseph chose not to. He chose to do and to let go, and that's what we find out here. And this is going to send us in, like I said, to what we're going to talk about later on. But any thoughts on that? Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Egypt was Osiris.
Yeah.
It's a god that he really, the Jews, they didn't, so the fact that Pharaoh had that faith to that point, something he's not going to see,
Yeah.
taking his voice of it, and then it gives him the whole world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a big
Yeah. And I think like with the butler that remembers Joseph miraculously, like remembers what he has done. You have to remember too, like the butler worked really close with Pharaoh, and there was trust there as well. But like you said though, he was going to have to believe in something that he didn't necessarily believe. I mean, because there was all these false religions, false things during that culture, paganism. Remember what we mentioned last week about Egypt? There were so many gods, pluralism with how many gods there were during this culture. And if you've done any type of study with Egyptians, they worship so many different gods, and it's really just intriguing to see how many they actually worship. And for him to say, okay, I'll listen to what you got to say. And then he sees it. And I believe that through God revealing these dreams to him, when Joseph speaks to Pharaoh and says, okay, this is what it means, Joseph made it very clear. He said, this is not of me, but this is God that is speaking through these dreams to you. And that, once again, oftentimes we think, wow, that's a really interesting way to work, but often isn't that how God works? He works in mysterious ways. He works in ways that oftentimes we may think are puzzling and can really just confound the mind. But God was working here, and He was working through Joseph. And He's working, yes, on the Pharaoh's heart here, because the Pharaoh, even through this, he speaks of this man and says that this man has a spirit of God about him. Interesting, for sure. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And maybe he was familiar with that, and he understood because of being in Egypt so long and in that culture. He knew that if he went before him the way he was, what type of a message is this going to send and present? So he made himself presentable to be alive. Yeah, because if you look at Egypt depictions upon paintings that you find in tombs or just wherever you go in Egypt, you'll find a lot of pharaohs are portrayed like that, especially if they're sitting on their thrones. They're portrayed in that way, the ones that have deceased and went on into the afterlife. Yeah. It's interesting when you think about Egypt. Like I told you all before, I've been before. And when they discovered the pyramid of Giza, they actually had to go in a different way to find access to the room of where the sarcophagus was, where it held the tomb of the pharaoh there. And who knows how many people went in there trying to scour the tombs and try to find jewelry and everything, and ended up dying because of that. Because the Egyptians, they worship false gods, yes, but they were very smart individuals and were smart about how they created things and were thinking ahead, preparing for something like that to happen. But they buried people in rooms. I mean, when they discovered, I think last week we mentioned about King Tutankhamun, when they discovered his tomb, his pyramid, that they discovered that, I think it was in the 1940s, that his whole room, his whole chamber was filled with things that he was supposed to take with him to the afterlife, which we know it was all left there because what they believed in was false to begin with. But they really took that seriously, and they believed. And you know what? It takes you into another thing. I'm kind of jumping around just a little bit here. But, you can be sincere about something, and I believe that they were sincere in what they believed, but also you can be sincerely wrong. And so, there's like a lot of cults today that are sincere in what they believe, But if you don't believe in the truth of the gospel, you can be sincerely wrong. I mean, and so, yeah, it's interesting though the work they put into that and what were found in these tombs. Anything so far caught your attention about Joseph that spoke to you? Yeah, man of faith. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else with a thought? All right. Well, next week we'll carry on, and remember, 2 weeks from tonight we won't meet for study because of Victory Kids, so just remember that. All right? All right, good deal. Well, let's stand tonight. We'll dismiss in a word of prayer. Barry, would you pray for us, please?
Father, we thank you, dear Lord, for allowing us this time to come to your house and study your precious word, dear Lord, and learn about the past and foresee in the future, Father. And Father, we thank you for all the things that you enlighten us with these messages in this lesson, Father. And we thank you for all that you do for us, and we know that you're always there, and you're always in control. We thank you for being the sovereign God that you are, and the forgiving God that you are, dear Lord. We thank you for all your grace and for your mercy, and we ask that you be with us until we meet again. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen.